I wrote the book because so many folks came up to me as my dad was dying and after he died and said that he was a good man. The guys that collected trash in our neighborhood the day after my father died parked his trash truck, and Jeannie and I were playing with our kids in the front yard, came over and wiped his hands on his jacket and shook hands and said, "I read about your father in the paper. He was a good man." I turned around and walked away, got back in the truck and drove off. The two waitresses from his favorite restaurant who waited in line at the wake and said, "Your father was a good man," and turned around and walked out of the church. The guy from the U.S. air counter at National Airport who said, "I took your father through security for 5 or 6 years when he was struggling with Alzheimer's. He was a good man." And at first I thought it was something nice that people said to somebody who just lost their father, lost their mother 18 months earlier. But I realized through the repetition of this that it meant something different than being a so-called great man. My dad got hailed in the newspaper for having created the Peace Corps, having created President Johnson's War on Poverty, the Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Job Corps, VISTA, foster grandparents, community health centers, and the list goes on. And those were so-called great things, but what these people meant when they said he was good, they meant something different. And in Washington, as it is in all places, so-called great men and women oftentimes aren't good people. So I wanted to figure out how a guy could be happily married for 56 years to the woman of his dreams, could raise 5 kids, all of whom love him, could go to Mass every day of his life, and I mean every day of his life, who could do these things on the global and national stage, who could spread Special Olympics around the world with my mom after he left and retired, and do it all with joy. Here was a guy that, if I came home with friends from Holy Cross, would have a couple of vodka tonics with you at night and laugh and smoke a cigar and tell stories, and then the next day would be at 7 o'clock Mass when we were all trying to get out of bed. I mean, here was a guy with an unlimited amount of energy. So I went back and read the letters that he wrote. He wrote me almost every day when I was in high school, and in college, definitely a letter or two. When I graduated and got married, still got a letter or two every day. And some of them I never opened because, I had little kids or I was working, and I put them in a file and said, "I'll come back and read them later," and never got back to them. So I wanted to go back and read those notes and then read some of the speeches that he gave that I had never taken the time to read because I was too busy at college or too busy trying to get my career going. Weak excuses, but they are what they are. So I went back and read those speeches, those notes, talked to people, and really figured out that the 3 virtues, the 3 things that defined his life were his faith, and it was a faith that demanded acts of hope and acts of love. He was born in 1915, and one of the amazing things I found out, he used to always tell me about his family had been around in Maryland politics and in Maryland government for 200 years, but Dad's grandfather, my father's grandfather took Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg as a 16-year-old kid. And that guy, after the Civil War, went into the seminary not once but twice, dropped out both times because he got sick, but became great friends with James Gibbons, who would go on to become the second cardinal in America, and my father's godfather. So he had a relationship with Cardinal Gibbons, and I think that faith, very active faith, sustained him through the Depression when his family moved to New York in 1929 to start a bank in the fall of 1929, so the timing couldn't have been worse. So my father had to work himself through high school, through college at Yale, and through Yale Law School, and that faith sustained him when he fought in World War II. He went into the Navy the day after he took his final exam before Pearl Harbor, and he survived brutal combat in the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Battle of Santa Cruz. And some of the letters that he wrote us as we got older and talked about living through gruesome battles and his faith helping him survive that. And you see this faith throughout his life. When he was at Yale, he invited Dorothy Day up to Yale to speak. And at that time, Dorothy Day, still considered by some to be a radical, if you will. And my father had and knew of her and brought her up to Yale when he was an undergraduate there. And that faith sustained him when he came back from the war, got a job working for Joe Kennedy running the merchandise mart in Chicago. And he worked with Cardinal Strick in Chicago to desegregate the Catholic hospitals and the Catholic schools to find full rights for people of color, our African Americans. And he did a lot of work with Martin Luther King in the 50s as well. And you see it throughout his life, not only this call for acts of hope. And one story which I'll tell you quickly is the story of the 1960 campaign when Senator Kennedy was running for president. Kennedy had been told not to say anything positive about Khrushchev, Castro, or King, or else the governors of the southern states would throw their support to Richard Nixon. And Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, had already endorsed Richard Nixon. He was a Republican, a Protestant, and there was a lot of concern about electing a Catholic president in 1960. And a couple of weeks before the election, Martin Luther King was arrested. And a lot of people thought he was going to be killed. And Dad knew him and knew Mrs. King, and suggested that Senator Kennedy reach out, and was told no, that wasn't going to happen. And he waited a couple of days later until Senator Kennedy was in a hotel room in Chicago, and he waited, he was in the room with him, and he waited till everybody left. And the last guy left was my dad and Kenny O'Donnell, who was Uncle Jack's closest advisor. Kenny O'Donnell goes into the bathroom, and Dad says to him, "Hey, would you call Mrs. King and say a few words of support to her?" And he said, "Okay, I'll do it, but I don't have her number." Dad pulls out her number, dials Coretta Scott King. They talk for less than a minute. Kenny O'Donnell comes out of the bathroom, says, "What is going on?" Tells him what happens. He goes crazy. They closed the Civil Rights Division down in that campaign, which my father ran, and all hell broke loose. But within 48 hours, Daddy King changed his endorsement from Nixon to Kennedy. Ralph David Abernathy and a number of other ministers came out in support of Kennedy. Again, mostly Protestants. And those words of endorsement got put into a pamphlet and sent all across the country to African American churches. And if you look at the African American vote in the 1960 election from the 56 to the 60, it went up in such a degree that most people think that got Senator Kennedy elected president. Some have said it was a great political move, but I think for my father it was an act of hope. He knew Martin Luther King, he knew Coretta Scott King, and I think he thought, coming from his family and the experience of being in a family that fought on both the North and the South, that if a guy who might get elected president reached out to an African-American minister and expressed some solidarity, that could make a difference in race relationships. And you see it, I think, throughout his career, whether it's creating the Peace Corps or whether it's creating the war against poverty. These acts of hope, I think, really define his life. And then you have the acts, the idea of of love. And one guy said to me, my father and mother dated for 7 years before they got married. And some guy said to me, "Your father had a lot of faith and a lot of hope that your mother was going to fall in love with him." And it's true. They were happily married for 56 years and, with raising 5 kids, again, all of whom love both my mother and my father. But I think the best example of his love, unconditional love, is the example that my brother Bobby told at the funeral. Bobby was arrested for smoking pot in 1970. And this isn't a state secret, so I'm not letting the cat out of the bag. But at that point in time, my Uncle Bobby had just died a few months earlier. And Uncle Jack had died a while before that. And people were thinking that Teddy might run for president. My father was thinking of running for governor of Maryland or maybe vice president or president. It was kind of unclear at that point. So it was on the front page of all the papers in the country. It was a big deal. And Bobby had long hair. And my father was out of town when he got arrested. And, he said that first day everybody cut his hair and there was a lot of yelling and screaming in the house. And he said when my dad got there, he told him to come to his room. And he said it was a really long walk down the hallway to my father's room. And Dad said to him, "Look, sit on the bed." He goes, "Look, you're a good kid. I'm going to take care of you. You have to take responsibility. But I love you and this is going to be okay." And that was it. And, I was in politics. I was elected. And I thought, as I thought about that, if I were thinking of running for governor of Maryland and my kid got arrested for smoking pot, how would I handle that? And I think that here was an example of a guy who realized that his career wasn't as important as how his kid was going to deal with a crisis like this, that it could be a make or break point for his son, and that if he loved him unconditionally, forgave him, held him accountable, but loved him, that kid would survive. And that's what Bobby said. He said that was the way he always saw manliness. And I asked him, as I was writing this book, what did he mean by that manliness? And he, there was a pause on the phone. He goes, I don't know. I just I use that word, and it's a different definition of what we as a culture think of manliness in America anyways, I think. I wrote the book because my wife and I are raising little kids. We're dealing with aging in-laws. And in America, men are supposed to be in charge of their families, and oftentimes they're supposed to yell at their kids or, boss their wives around. And here was an example of a guy on the national stage who clearly could have, yell at his kid, and who chose a totally different approach. It's a totally different definition of manliness, to offer unconditional love and support, and to help your kid get through it rather than yelling at him. And as a father and as a husband, to try to understand that and to do it with joy is one of the reasons that I wrote this book. I just say a couple more words and I'm going to shush. My dad had Alzheimer's the last 10 years of his life, and it is a brutal disease. It is devastating financially and emotionally for so many families, including ours. To see someone, my father's case, so brilliant and caring, struggle over a 10-year period is definitely brutal. But I also, upon reflecting and writing this book, thought about some of the moments of insight that I got during that. And I thought maybe I'd just share one or two of them with you. My daughter, Molly, is 14 years old. The father mentioned she just started high school. But, about 5 years ago, when Dad still was with us, Molly plays lacrosse. And it was a beautiful day, and I was out watching her play lacrosse. And she is a wonderful kid. She got elected president of her elementary school. But she does not have a competitive bone in her body. And in my family, that's a little weird. And I looked over at her one day, and she's down there, and the ball's on the other side of the field. And she was gabbing with the goalie on the opposing team. And I was like, oh, my God, what's going on? And she was talking to the goalie, and they're chatting away. And after the game, I'm walking back, and I said, Molly, honey, what are you doing? And she goes, the goalie's so nice. I'm going to meet her at a dance. I really like her. She can become a friend of mine. I'm like, honey, you got to take the lacrosse ball and throw it at her head. You got to, score on her. What are you doing? And so it passed. The next weekend I got Dad, and we went out and took him to the lacrosse game. And, I started getting emotional, still thinking about that experience the weekend before. And I was yelling at her, move, you got to move. I didn't say any nasty words, but you move. And he was sitting in a chair, and Dad turned up to me and goes, hey. And I said, oh, boy, something's the matter here. And he goes, did I yell at you like that when you were playing? And I went, wow, I didn't even know he knew I was his kid at that point. Did he know that was his granddaughter? And as I reflected on it, I realized that he didn't yell at us because he knew that sports were important, but they weren't that important. And he knew that we weren't going to become professional athletes. And he knew that what was really important was the fact that his granddaughter was out enjoying God's grandeur, that she was making new friends, she was playing sports, she was moving her limbs, she was enjoying life, and that was really what was important. And I said to him, no, you didn't yell. And he goes, good. And that was the end of the conversation. But he was teaching me, in those moments of great suffering, still trying to get the message out that what was really important was loving your kids and supporting your kids and not having to yell at them necessarily and scream like I was doing. The other thing, the last story I'll share with you is we were driving over to our house once when he had Alzheimer's, and he was kind of clear-headed, I thought, and we stopped at a light. I still know exactly where the intersection is. And for some reason or another, I said to him, Daddy, you're losing your mind. How does it make you feel? And without missing a beat, he said, I'm doing the best I can with what God has given me. And I was like, what? And I realized as I was writing this book and trying to figure out how the guy was so joyful constantly, is that he was always doing the best he could with what God had given him. It didn't matter whether he was trying to survive the Depression with no money, whether he was trying to survive brutal combat in World War II, whether he was creating the Peace Corps, or when Jackie Kennedy called him up on Friday when President Kennedy got killed and said, "Can you put the funeral together for Monday?" I mean, imagine that just for a second, okay? Getting a phone call. He had 3 kids under the age of 10. His wife was pregnant with me, and he was asked by Mrs. Kennedy to pull together a funeral in 48 hours for the first Catholic president killed, right? So there was no manual. Lincoln had been killed 100 years earlier. Is it a Catholic service? Is it a state service? People from all around the world coming in. How do you deal with all that stuff? He was doing the best he could with what God had given him. And I think he kept that attitude as a kid all the way through. And I just thought that that was an amazing statement to say in the midst of Alzheimer's, which is, as I said, a disease that is ravishing and ultimately strips you to your core. And in his case, stripped him to his core, yet showed a core that was filled with faith, filled with hope, filled with love. So I want to thank you, Father, for all the folks here for coming. I think it's kind of interesting that we're honoring a guy that ran for public office twice and got crushed both times, who never complained about losing political races, but who lost both of those races, who fought a war against poverty, illiteracy, misunderstanding, and prejudice, a war, frankly, that is still raging today. He didn't win that war. It's still a battle that a number of us, and myself included, are trying to be foot soldiers in that battle. A guy who fought for 10 years against Alzheimer's and lost. In a culture where we, raise up people who make money and who do something, in many cases, nothing more than are famous for being lewd or rude, we're honoring a guy that struggled, that did his best, that lost, but who reminded us and reminds me on a daily basis that the really powerful thing in life is the power of faith, a faith that demands acts of hope and acts of love. So thank you for honoring such a man. I really appreciate it. Thank you. We have a couple questions. I'd like to thank the lady who gave me a standing ovation there. She's the only one. She's now my new best friend in San Francisco. If you have a question, you're allowed to ask the first one. Thank you. I don't know, Father, do you want to? I don't.
A quick question about people. If you can write on the card, but let me throw you a quick question. So your dad wrote you a letter, or 2 letters. Did he write to all the kids the same way?
He wrote. No, he would. You'd get some. I mean, the man. I don't know, I was told I could talk for, 20 or 30 minutes, but I felt like I was rambling on. So the answer is that he would go, he'd go to sleep at, 10:30 or 11. He'd sleep till about 1, and then he'd read from 1 to 3, and then he'd sleep from 3 to 4:30, get back up and write some more. And it was terrible in high school, because when you tried to sneak in, you'd go by his door, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, there was always a light on. And you'd walk in there, and, how you doing? And he'd have his head propped up on the most uncomfortable headrest, which is really a slab of wood that somehow he had picked out. He'd have a pillow, and he'd be reading. And around his bed, was Foreign Affairs, the Baltimore Orioles box score, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, a book on Mother Teresa, a book by Elie Wiesel, something from what was going on with, the history of the Catholic Church. The guy was just reading all this stuff. And he had, like my mother, this long legal pad, and he would write a note. And it was hilarious, because he used to leave notes for my mother, and there'd be like 3 of them outside of her door. And she'd walk out and go, oh, my God. And, he would leave, he'd slip a note under your door, and it could be about the dinner conversation the night before. It could be about a book he was reading. It could be about somebody he bumped into. It could be 5 sentences. You know, when I was in college, I'd get a letter and be, Mark, did you see what Jim Palmer did in the Baltimore Orioles game last night? He struck out 6 and only walked 1. And then you'd open up the next letter and it would be a note typed out, Bobby, Maria, Mark, Timmy, Anthony. And he'd send a book. And it would be, I read this book by Cardinal Lustiger, who's a convert to Catholicism. He's French, and here's a book he wrote on the Our Father, which I think is actually the book he wrote on it. In that case, he put a contest together and said, whoever writes the best essay, I'll give $500. So he would, encourage you to read stuff. And he'd send 5 copies, he'd send the same letter to everyone, and then you all got a book. And in that case, the little Lustiger book is about that big. And he just produced that stuff constantly. So he's thinking, he's thinking about ideas. He was thinking about religion and politics and life and how to behave. And I went back in and opened those letters and read them. One letter I came upon, which is in the back of the book, was the note he wrote me the day I graduated from high school. And I forgot about it until I found it in the scrapbook when I was writing the book. And it was handwritten, 6 sentences. And it was not, go to college, do well, and you'll make a lot of money and work hard. It was about God and love, and that God loves you, and that's the most important thing. And I was looking at it, I'm like, it's a totally different, what that must have meant to me as an 18-year-old kid versus as a father at that point as 46 with 3 kids. It means something different. And the beauty of having something in his handwriting and being able to read it and reread it, I carry it around now in my briefcase, and to think about that. It means something different every time I read it. And nowadays, people write a text, to your kids. They write, "How are you?" And they write, "Okay." And then everybody hits delete. And there's no record of it, right? But he came from a tradition, where they wrote longhand, maybe dictated a couple notes to his, secretary and churned those out. But the power of those notes and being able to read them and reread them is something really powerful. I think one of the best things that happened to me in this book is that somebody who actually wrote a review of the book told me that he wrote his kid a note the day he graduated from high school, from good counsel, actually, father. Father also went to school, and he said he wrote him a note, and the kid didn't say anything because, most 18-year-old boys grunt, if they're, hello, one of those things. And he said 2 weeks after graduating, the kid told him it was the best present he got. And the guy's like, wow. He just wrote his kid a note. And that was the power of the note, because the kid knew that the father was taking time to write something that meant something to him. It's a powerful gift. Yes. But he said to me countless times, and I'd say, God, this is so irritating, and it's a disaster. And he said, look, Jesus was God, and he picked 12 guys, and one of them, turned him over, and one of them, his best friend, betrayed him 3 times at his moment of crisis. He goes, human beings, it's a messy thing here, and you just got to keep going at it. I mean, Jesus didn't even pick 12 of the right guys, right? I mean, he didn't. Peter backed out, right? And so I think he'd say you just got to stay at it. And here was a guy, that worked within the church structure, worked with the Catholic Conference of Bishops to overturn Reagan's policy on nuclear war, worked very closely with Republicans and Democrats to change the first strike policy, who believed in the church, obviously, but always was working to, push the cause forward, and who went to Mass every day. And I think that that's a really important thing. Here's a guy that had some, dough, had political power, but who got on his knees every day and realized that he needed help. And I think, again, for men, for all of us, but for men in particular, to acknowledge that you're not in control is a big deal. And I think he realized that he was not in control. I don't think he realized it. I know he did. And that's why he went to Mass, because he needed help. And he needed that energy and that direction that he got in that prayerful relationship, where he got quiet and prayed and then went out of church every morning like on fire. Wow, ooh, this is great. he was just excited, and I wrote a little in the introduction, what the interesting thing about the guy was, I went duck hunting with him one day, and we were late. We went over the Bay Bridge in Maryland, and the sun was rising, and which meant we were late. And I was irritated. I was 23 and mad because he had made us late. And he looked over there and he said, "I can't wait to meet the creator who made that." And he just saw, like in every moment, that there was some beauty, whether it was talking to the president of the university or somebody whose staff, or frankly, the people who are going to clean up this room after we all walk out of here. They're all a gift. And he either believed that God is everywhere and in everybody, or is nowhere. And I think he saw it in everybody. And I think he saw, that the church is an institution. It's got problems. We all got problems. But you got to keep working at it. You got to kneel down every day and ask for help. And you got to slug it out. You don't give up. He was also he went to the local parish. He was one of, kind of old school. Some people said, well, this parish isn't as good as the other one downtown. And he went to the same one, because that was your local parish, and you were supporting it. So, and he'd slug it out, day in and day out. My mother was a little different, though. She had a lot of, different type of energy. But they both got it. My mother went to Mass every day. But if she missed morning, you could tell where she was just by the Masses. If she missed the 8, you knew she was at the 12 or the 5, and you could follow her track around Washington. But it was to get that energy, to be refreshed by it. Some people go to the gym, they went every day to the Mass to get fired up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shriver.
Did I talk too long? Or
no, you're doing fine.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I just wanted to catch you with one of our questions before.
Sure.
Someone goes around and picks up all the questions that are on the note cards that you guys received. So the first one that we have for you is, how did you get involved in Save the Children, and what drives you to continue working in this area? Actually, it's a few questions packed into one topic. How do you personally manage the frustrations that come along with the social issues that you work in?
Right.
And how do you remain optimistic?
So I've been at Save the Children for 10 years. After I graduated from Holy Cross, I started a program that works with juvenile delinquent kids in Baltimore City. And it's a secular organization, but I thought it was an effort to, my father and mother had done, to do social justice work, to put your faith into action. And it's working with kids that had been arrested. I did that for 6 years. The program's still around. And then got married, got a master's degree, then came back, went into the state legislature, and then ran for Congress and lost, but then got recruited to go run Save the Children. So I've been there for 10 years. And the answer is, I think it's a national organization, and I felt like it was a chance to work with poor kids across the country, to try to help them enter school ready to learn. And I think if you look around, the real issue for me today is that poor kids are so far behind before they get into kindergarten that we've just really shortchanged these kids. We screwed them, really. I mean, these poor kids are 4 years of age. They're 18 months behind my kids, and behind maybe your children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, whatever. If you're living in poverty, you're so far behind, and we spend billions of dollars trying to remediate that. And so for me, it's an issue of social justice. It's the idea that if a poor kid doesn't have some of the resources that my kids have, and they start so far behind, I got to try to do something about that. Is it frustrating? I was talking to Father about it at lunch. Absolutely. Sometimes I feel so invigorated when I go in and see our work, fired up, and I'm so excited. And sometimes I walk out of it and I'm like, oh my God, we're making a tiny dent here. But one of my dad's favorite lines was from Mother Teresa, and it was that God doesn't ask you to succeed, God asks you to try. And there was a guy that, as I said at the end of my little talk, who tried, who got crushed in politics, started the Peace Corps. It's not as big as he would want it to be today, who is involved in the war against poverty, but poverty rates are still high, but he tried. And there's worse things in life than to be caught trying to help other people, and that's what he does, and that's what I try to do. You try to go out and keep going, and we work in a lot of poor states, Central Valley of California. If you took it as a state, I think it'd be the 15th biggest state in the country, And Central Valley of California, geographically, would be the 15th biggest state in the country, and I believe the poorest state in the country. So that's your state, and what are we doing about that? So we're trying to help kids be educationally ready to enter kindergarten, ready to learn. So it's a huge issue, and you just got to keep plugging away. But sometimes I do feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall. You don't know whether you're making progress, but you got to keep trying. Did that answer all the questions in there?
Yes, I think that was perfect. Thank you.
I'm sorry, say that again. I was perfect?
Oh, yeah, that was
Yeah, okay. You can say that every time I'm finished, and then you'll pass the lady who gave me the standing ovation as my favorite person in San Francisco. Yes?
I love that little anecdote about your mother, how you could track where she was during the day. My mother's the same way.
My condolences.
She's the one praying for me. So.
What?
I said she's the one praying for me.
Yes. It's important.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, we're honoring your father because, as you've mentioned, that he just struggled and fought and lost many times, but he saw what was the core in life, and as you mentioned, were faith, hope, and love. And can you explain to us how you stay grounded in those same principles and what you do to keep them at the forefront of your daily life?
I'll be honest with you. I struggle with it. Before I had kids, I'd go to Mass, 4 times a week. Kids get around, and they jump in bed before I go to Mass, and I don't want to leave them, and I miss Mass. I struggle with it. It's hard to stay grounded. He had an unbelievable discipline to go to Mass every day, and I don't do that as well. He didn't, I said he didn't yell at us as kids growing up playing sports. I kind of do. I don't do it as much as I did before I wrote this book. I write my kids, 4 or 5 times a year. I don't write them every day. So it's hard. There's a lot of balancing things that I struggle with, and I think part of life is the struggle, and to incrementally do it a little bit better. I said this too. I don't think this is a violation, but I went to confession the other day and I was talking to the priest about it, and he said, "Here's your penance. You have to say prayers every day for 30 seconds." I'm like, "Yeah, that's easy." And my college roommate is a priest, and he's like, "He told you to say prayers for 30 seconds?" And the guy was brilliant, because if you say it for 30 seconds, next thing you know, you're doing it for 45 seconds, and then you're doing it for a minute, and then you're doing it for 5 or 10 minutes. It's just the discipline of it, and I struggle with that, to be honest with you. Trying to, there's making some progress and whoop, and go back down. Sometimes I get up in the morning and check the iPhone before I check, do a reading or say a prayer. So it's hard, and I think you gotta keep plugging away and try and do the best you can with it. Sounds like a cop out, but I'm trying. It's hard though. You gotta just keep remembering that. And in our culture, I was thinking about it on the flight out here. You think about like the Kardashians and Paris Hilton. These are people that became famous because they had sex tapes done. It's like craziness, and people are famous for being famous. So when you look at a guy that got crushed in politics and Alzheimer's, and you talk about faith, hope, and love. The book made the bestseller list, but it's not number 1 for a year and a half. As a friend of mine who worked at Vanity Fair said, "I'd put you on the cover of Vanity Fair, but your father didn't kill anybody, and he didn't have an affair." So I'm like, okay, so you just got to, I think, stay focused on what's really important in life. And there's a quote in the book that Dad had when he got the award as Father of the Year. And he got it in 1964, which I remind my siblings was the year I was born, so he became Father of the Year. But he said it's not your annuities or your homes that make you a Father of the Year. What's important is what you give your kids and what you give your friends, and that ultimately is what's important. The rest of it is BS. It's it's the trappings of power and fame, and all that stuff is fleeting. I'll tell you one other story. And then when he ran for president, it was great, because when you're a little kid, you have the Secret Service there around, and they're big guys that could protect your family or your father, and they're fun because they play sports with you. And I remember going on the airplane the day he dropped out. We went on a vacation just to get out of town, and you walk down the runway to get on the airplane, the whatever they call it, the pathway to get on the airplane. And the guy goes, "Here, Mr. Shriver," they sign that document, and the door closes, and they're gone. And we landed in the Dominican Republic. We went down there and got out of the airplane and had to hail a cab. It's over. I mean, when it's over in politics. And I never forgot that. I was 76. I was 12 years old. Because what really is important is your family, your faith, your friends, and what you're doing. It makes a difference. Because if you're in politics and, when I got out of politics, I used to get 100 letters a day. I got like 2. And I knew that, the other 98 were from people that only cared because I could vote for them or help them out. And what was really important was the work I was trying to do day in and day out. And my father never lost track of that. He was never upset or irritated that he lost. He was doing the best he could with what God had given him, and that was a chance to do something good the next day. Was that perfect too?
It was perfect.
It's perfect.
No, see, I'm supposed to say it's perfect. If you do, then you
you're
replace
perfect.
me.
I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you.
She's trying to replace me as being your second favorite person in San Francisco. This one is from the audience, and it is a member of the audience who said, "I read your book thoroughly and enjoyed it. I remember a story about a game, I believe, where you or your brother cried. Your father told you, or your brother, that it was okay to cry, unlike what the Kennedys might say. Can you talk about that a bit?"
Sure. It's a story that my brother Bobby, who seems like a troubled child. Are you going to put this on the internet, Father? Bobby's not troubled. He's a wonderful human being. No, but Bobby was, I don't know, 13 or 14, and I was, probably 3 or 4, so I don't remember it, but I've heard it so many times, it's a part of me. And he got knocked down, and he started to cry, and Uncle Bobby went over to him and said, "Don't cry, Kennedys don't cry." And Daddy scooped him up and said, "That's okay, you can cry, you're a Shriver." And, it's funny, but it speaks to emotional, wellness, that it's okay to cry, it's okay to get hurt, and it's okay to cry, especially if you're a 13-year-old kid, people cry. And, I think the point of it is that he understood these range of emotions, and he was comfortable in it, and that's healthy, and that he knew who he was, and that if he cried or his kid cried, it wasn't that his kid was any less of a human being. He's more of he's a full human being. So I think the point of the story, at least what I gleaned from it, was that, here was a guy that was surrounded by powerful and politically powerful people, high energy, had his own source of energy, and yet was comfortable enough that if things weren't going well, he could tell his kids it's okay to cry. And that's totally healthy. To kind of not show emotions and to pretend you're not who you are is ultimately not terribly healthy. So I think that was the story. That was what I got out of it. I don't know if the person who asked the question wanted to say anything else about it. Am I allowed to say that? So my father had this, story that it's just like his great-great-grandfather had written, was one of the signers of the Maryland Constitution. So his family, which established the freedom of religion, separation of church and state, started in Maryland, which, as many of you know, is a Catholic colony. And my mother used to say, separation of church and state, all that stuff started with the Pilgrims up in Boston. And Daddy would go, not really. It happened in Maryland with the Catholics. So he had a long tradition of being very grounded in Maryland history, and his family ran the post office in the western part of Maryland. And here was a family that was very politically active. It was a big deal in Maryland. He sat on Governor Ritchie's lap when Governor Ritchie and the Shriver family went up to hear Al Smith accept the Democratic nomination. Ironically, he was the first Catholic nominated. So he knew Al Smith, he knew Governor Ritchie in whatever that was, 1924, when Al Smith got nominated as the Catholic. Ironically, in 1960, he then is playing a prominent role in Senator Kennedy's race. So I think he knew, I don't think he did, I knew he knew who he was, and he knew, these people are my family, loves them, supported them, loved my mother, crazy in love with her, and, was a member of it. But he also knew who he was. And I think it's really important that you have your own identity and you know who you are. And I think a lot of us, struggle with that, not just in this family, but in all families. Who am I? What am I really doing here? I got an in-law who's got more money than me, and, he makes 300 grand a year, and I make 50, I'm insecure about it. And none of that stuff mattered to him, I think, because he knew who he was and he knew he had a relationship with God, and that was ultimately was more important than any of the other trappings of power, because it's all gone. It goes. It was at President Obama's inauguration 4 years ago, and we were right near the toilets and about 700 yards away. And I turned to my wife and my kids there, and we were all freezing, and we literally had to get on the toilets to see Obama. And I said, what was that, in 1960 to when Obama got elected was, 35, 40 years? This is what happens. You're in the toilet section 40 years later. You got to remember that. And what's important is, your relationship with God, and the rest of it is, and I think he knew that. He thoroughly enjoyed it, but he knew it. Yes, ma'am.
I have another question for you. This is another audience submitted. What do you think the fundamental difference between the Baltimore Ravens and the San Francisco 40? I'm just kidding.
Father asked me that question. I have to be honest with you. I'm rooting for the 49ers. And
you are perfect.
It's not. I feel like the Ravens have a long history because when I was in the legislature, the Ravens left Cleveland and came to Baltimore, and the exact same thing happened to Baltimore when the Colts left and went to Indianapolis. And I just thought it was total irony and terrible that the people in Baltimore were so hurt by the Colts leaving, and then the people in Cleveland, including one of my roommates who loved the Browns, got shortchanged just like the people in Baltimore. So I think the Ravens I'm rooting for the 49ers. I just can't stand the Ravens. I think it's just terrible.
You've become my favorite San Francisco visitor.
Thank you.
But the real question is, what do you think is the fundamental difference between the discipline and exacting standards of your father's generation and the generations of today?
What do I think is the difference?
Between the discipline and exacting standards.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I just think that somebody asked me today when I was with Father Prevet about my father's relationship with George McGovern. And here are two guys that ran on a peace platform, both of whom had been in brutal combat in World War II. Lost to two guys that called them unpatriotic, and neither one of them fought in the war. But those two guys, they didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the commitment that they made. They didn't talk about the people once in a while about who they were friendly with who had died in the war. I don't know. I think that those folks, they understood that this country is the greatest country on earth, and that you got to protect it and you got to make a commitment to it. And I think they believed they weren't. McGovern wasn't a Catholic, but both had this sense that God had given them blessings and that they needed to make a commitment to the community. Look, politics is a brutal sport. It's been a combat sport. If you watch the Lincoln movie, it's been brutal since the days of Adams and Jefferson. But I think that they came together after it was over to try to work together and try to pull people together. And I think we've lost that. As Father asked the question, I think we get separated. So many people separate you between, Democrat and Republican, gay, straight, or are you Protestant or Catholic? And I think, his faith was a faith that called people together to work together. And the quote in the book, which I love, when I found a speech he wrote, it said, Rabbi Weinberg, Father Kelly, and Monsignor Smith, let's work together to do our Father's business, capital O, capital F, in the mid-'60s, coming from a public employee. So he tried to pull people together, both when he needed to defend the country and then when we needed to do a better job helping the poor in this country and abroad. And we just seem to have lost that. It's discouraging at times. I'm still hopeful that we can, and you hear some language, I think, occasionally coming out of Washington that talks about unity and working together. Who asked the question? Do you have an answer? Oh. I think it's, frankly, I think it comes back to a lot of us. We're not demanding it. And democracy is not only a contact sport, but it's a participatory sport. And, we don't ask our representatives to do these things on either the state or federal level because I think so many of us feel, well, there's no way we're going to make a difference, and I'm not going to bother them in Sacramento or in D.C. So I think we got to get more engaged and try to take it back. People are just apathetic, and I think, unfortunately, President Reagan, the expression "you're better off today than you were 4 years ago" makes us all look at our own bottom line and our bank account, when I think in that generation it was more about, is the country better off and are we moving together? And I think that sense of, greed is good and focusing on our own bank account has pulled us away. So I'm hoping people will talk more about it and, demand that their public officials, think about these things and talk about it in a more civilized way to pull us all together. Do you ever write your state reps? Yeah. You asked the question. Do you do anything with the folks in Washington and ask them to be more civilized or to work, better together? I think that's part of it. I think it's not just the politicians. I think it's all of us. I think it's the church. I think it's the people that run the civic, the Kiwanis Club or whatever it is. I think everybody's got a role in it. I think if you were expecting politicians to lead, coming from a family of political folks, oftentimes politicians don't lead. They follow. I mean, look at the real change agents. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Lech Walesa. I mean, these guys, Cesar Chavez out here. I mean, you look at those folks, they're like the powerless, right? And they're bringing down communism. They're, Gandhi bringing down the British Empire. Rosa Parks bringing down segregation. These are all coming from below. They're the people that are powerless, that have no money and no, position, and they're changing the world. I mean, look at the whole thing in Egypt a couple years ago. I mean, so I think if you're expecting, Abraham Lincoln to come here and lead, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think you got to be, take it by the horns. Father mentioned my mom. She was pissed that her sister couldn't play sports. She had a developmental disability and couldn't play sports like everybody else in her family. Organizes games in our backyard, Special Olympics. Changes the laws on housing, employment, education for people with developmental disabilities. It's a fired up woman. There's nothing like a woman who's on a mission. You know what I mean? I mean, it's true. And she's fired up, and she'd go right in there and give it. I mean, when I was in the state legislature, she'd go, "How you doing?" "I'm fine." "How you doing, Mommy?" "Good." "I hear you're working on an employment bill." I said, "Well, yeah." And she goes, "Well, have you put something in there for people with developmental disabilities? The unemployment rate for people with developmental differences is 85%, and they don't have enough housing. I'm going to have Steve Eidelman call you up and give you language on that." I'm like, okay, And boom, that guy would call who worked for her. Bam, the language was in there in the bill. She was on a mission, and she was focused. And she used sports to change people's perception of that, because if people could play with developmental differences, can play team sports and can run faster than probably everybody in this room, they ought to be able to live together. They ought to get employment. They ought to be able to have the same opportunities. And she used it and got fired up about it. So I think if you're waiting for the people in Washington, I think you got to do it, and you got to get 10 other people and get fired up about it. And so do I, frankly. Are you allowed to ask a question, or am I? No. Sure, go ahead. I think that's the way it's going to be. You have a strong lobby. I think absolutely right. I mean, look at Matt. That's another great example. I mean, look at the whole recycling thing came about because kids started saying, if you don't recycle stuff, the polar bears are going to die, right? And it all came to kids. My kids shame me on if I throw a top away. They're like, put it in recycle. So, it's got to come from, again, Mothers Against Drunk Driving is a great example. I was in the legislature and people were like, you can't lower the alcohol rate. And the mothers would come in there and the next thing you know, the rate goes down. It's because they're mobilized, and politicians are afraid of votes. Their language is votes and money. So if you can mobilize votes and or money, that'll make a difference. And I think it's going to be uphill sledding on the gun control issue. But I think if people get mobilized and make an effort and get rallies, it'll make a difference. I think it's a huge issue. Save the Children. We worked with a bunch of groups on the poverty issue to try to get one question asked in the presidential debates about poor children in America. And it had a bunch of big shots, head of nonprofits. I was a member of it, asking and asking. We didn't get anywhere. What we should have done, and we didn't think about it, is get 500,000 people to write a demand that one question about kids living in poverty in America be asked in the presidential debates. So we got a petition online right now. We got 20,000 signatures in a couple of days, asking that the president call for a national commission on children. Last one was President Reagan in '87. It came up with the earned income tax credit, the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program, and the earned income the Child Independent Tax Credit. We haven't had a commission look at kids' issues in 25 years. So, if you want to, you go to SaveTheChildren.org, sign the petition, and, I don't know if that's your kid next to you. Tell him to get, 50 kids to sign it up on a high school. And, maybe we can get it. I'm going to go meet with the domestic policy head on Monday. And I'd love to say, hey, I don't have 20,000 names, I got 50,000. Your son doesn't look too excited about that. Kind of looks like my daughter. Okay, Daddy, I'll do it. Leave me alone. But that's, it's kids. It's kids. It's people that are focused on it.
Thank you.
Glad you came tonight. What year are you? Where do you go to school?
I go to day school right here in the city.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, why don't you sign the petition and you can get all your buddies to sign it too. And the young ladies will think you're really cool for doing something good.
I really appreciate what you're saying about what you said at the last question about being a change agent and how it doesn't necessarily need to come from a politician, and then now what you've said about the fact that it can be adolescents and youth too. And something that we really wanted to have answered, because we are being Jesuit educated right now, and what we've learned about social justice is, what are your recommendations to students like us and how we can truly get involved, especially post-graduation, in advocacy and lobbying, anything that's related to a way to end domestic poverty specifically?
I think if you look at my father's example, he really worked, the Peace Corps is all about young people. And one of my favorite stories that I, again, didn't know, but I read it in a speech, was he went, I think it was to Indonesia, I can't remember, and a young woman who was a nurse, Peace Corps volunteer, asked him to go into a leprosy ward. And he wrote, I didn't want to go in there, I was scared. And I was like, wow, Daddy was scared. And then I'm like, well, he was scared because he was human, right? And if somebody asked me to go into a leprosy ward, I guess I'd be scared too. And he went in. And he said the real power of going in there was seeing this woman, who's an American, deal with people that were suffering from leprosy. And that the touch between the two of them was what would affect peace. That, somebody living in the city capital and the State Department negotiating some peace issue isn't the same kind of peace as human beings working side by side. And that nurse showing a different side of America and showing the connection between human beings and actually working together. And I think he saw the power of young people willing to do that, willing to go into the leprosy ward. My nephew is in Peru right now as a Peace Corps volunteer working on an irrigation system. He went to Loyola down in LA. I think that you can do those things. It's the Peace Corps, it's City Year, it's potentially working at Save the Children, it's Teach for America. All these things are really spin-offs of, the Peace Corps, if you will. And young people can do it just like, a mom on a mission. And if somebody tells you can't, you tell them to take a flying leap that you can. You got to stay at it. So I think that's what the Jesuits teach, right? It's about being a man and a woman for others, and it's about looking outward. I did an interview with Maria on the book last June with my brother Bobby, and my dad gave a great speech, which I mentioned in the book, at Yale, and it was the time of Michael Jackson's song "A Man in the Mirror." Look at yourself in the mirror, and he twisted it around and said, "Break your mirrors." And stop looking at yourself and start looking at your neighbors. And I said, I never met a guy who was more outwardly focused. And she said, I never met a person who was more inwardly focused. And the reporter's like, okay, you're disagreeing. But he was inwardly focused, and then he was outwardly focused. And I think that young people, if they're outwardly focused, can help us, stop looking at ourselves in the mirror, which is what he asked the Yale students. Stop looking at yourself and to start looking outwardly. And I think if you do that, that's really what the Jesuits, taught me, and I'm trying to do, is to be a man and woman for others, to look outward. to pray inwardly, to be a contemplative, but to do action. And isn't that right, Father? Got it. Very good. That's good. That's good. It's a perfect answer. Thank you. Are we done? We're done. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Thank you all very much. I know there's 1,000 things going on, but I appreciate it. Thank you.